There is a very popular way that Christians, especially evangelical Christians, try to answer a very old philosophical problem regarding where morality comes from. But before I get to that, let's just set up the problem about where does morality come from. Well, there are lots of theories out there regarding morality, regarding ethics, and what makes something a good action or a bad action. And one theory is divine command theory. One theory that's very popular among theists, whether they are Christians, Jews, Muslims, is a view called divine command theory. And you probably have heard of that. And it is simply the notion, the theory that morality is based in God giving commands, us getting divine commands. And that is the source or the basis or the foundation of our whether or not we are being good morally speaking. If we're following these divine commands, then we are being good morally, and if we're not following these divine commands, then we're not. So there's been all kinds of debate about where did this morality come from, and one very popular answer is divine command theory. There's an age-old, and I mean ancient, problem with this theory, and it's one that is written about by Plato. And Plato was a student of Socrates, and Aristotle was a student of Plato. So Plato is regarded as one of the greatest Western philosophers, or any kind of philosopher, in the history of humanity. In fact, Alfred North Whitehead once said that all of Western philosophy is but a footnote on Plato. That's how influential he has been. So Plato wrote in dialogue form. He didn't write in lecture form like we're used to reading today. If you pick up a handbook, a textbook, Aristotle was more of a narrative type writing, but Plato didn't write in narrative styles. It was a little bit harder to understand him, but he would write in dialogue, stories of different people having these different characters, almost like reading a play. And he would write these dialogues, and the name of these dialogues would oftentimes be the main character. Oftentimes, Socrates is in these dialogues, and he's interacting with other people. And in one dialogue, we see this main character called the Euthyphro. Maybe you've heard of the pre-Socratic dialogues of Plato. The pre-Socratic dialogues are those that were written earlier on, and they were supposed to be written in the style of what we'd expect to see with Socrates, or more about Socrates. He's the mouthpiece. A lot of debate about how much of Socrates really is shining through, and how much of this really is Plato. But in this one dialogue, Socrates is being persecuted for supposedly corrupting the youth and leading people into atheism. And so remember, this is a very polytheistic society, and so Socrates was apparently wrongly accused of this, but he was going down to be prosecuted. He was walking down, and he ran into this guy named Euthyphro, who was actually a prosecutor himself, and he said, what are you doing? And Euthyphro said he was going to get his father and prosecute him for allowing a slave to die in a ditch. And Socrates couldn't get over this. Why would you want to prosecute your own father? That just doesn't seem right. So why are you doing this? And Euthyphro said, it is because this is what the gods want. It's what they think is pious. So Euthyphro and Socrates went back and forth for a while in this dialogue, saying, okay, well, what does it mean to be pious? If the gods want this, and that's what pious means, then what does it mean to be pious? And so Euthyphro tried to give several examples. Well, this is pious and that's pious. And Socrates said, no, I don't want examples of what's pious or what's good. I want the definition, the nature of what's good. And interestingly, this is what Aristotle said that Socrates kind of introduced into philosophy at the time, which was looking at the nature of things, asking questions. And this is the Socratic dialogue, asking these questions. But Socrates wanted to get at the nature and the essence of various things. In this case, piety or goodness. We can just say goodness. So Socrates says, well, what is goodness? What is piety? And Euthyphro kept saying, well, this and that and the other. And he says, no, I want the nature or the essence of it. What is it? And so Euthyphro one time said in this discussion, well, something's pious if the gods love it. Remember, we're talking about a polytheistic society. So he said that something is good or pious if the gods love it. And that's kind of problematic for Socrates, because some of the gods might love it and some gods might not. So how do you deal with the gods having a difference of opinion on whether or not something was good or pious? And so they eventually came to the problem of, well, if is something really pious because the gods love it, or do the gods love it already because it's pious? And this is kind of the heart of the issue. And this is a problem for divine command theory and for those theorists to overcome. A famous atheist of the 20th century, Bertrand Russell, modernized this Euthyphro dilemma and said, does God say something is good, kind of monotheisticizing it, if I can make up a word? Does God call something good because it's good in and of itself? Or is it good just because God says so? And there's a problem with either one of those answers, apparently. Because if something is good on its own, apart from God saying this is good, then the question of, well, where does this goodness really come from? And it doesn't seem like it's ultimately based on God. And then God isn't the cause of all things. And this calls into a question God's aseity. Aseity from the Latin se, a new word, se, meaning through oneself or through himself. And this is the notion that God is not dependent on anything for his being, his existence, but everything else is dependent on him. Well, the question is, if something is good in and of itself, then the question arises, well, where does it come from? And then how is it not based on God in some way? It seems to call God's control and divine omniscience, divine sovereignty, rather, in the question. But the other side of the dilemma says, well, if something is good simply because God says it is, then can God not simply say anything he wants? Can God not just declare that murder and rape are good? Well, people don't want to seemingly say that. There have been Christians who wanted to say that, like William of Ockham, for example, was an extreme voluntarist in the sense that he says that God's not bound by anything in terms of logic, morality, and whatever he says goes. He can just declare anything by fiat, and it's just how it is. And that's more of that would line up better with a more Islamic view of God. Then there is the essentialist view of God, which says that God issues commands according to his nature. And this is going to be one of the main ways that Christians, especially evangelicals, have tried to answer this Euthyphro dilemma. So they want to maintain two things. One, that God is the cause of all things in the universe, that all things depend on him for their existence, for their goodness, and for whatever they have. And we also don't want to say God is arbitrary. So these are the problems with the Euthyphro dilemma, is that we don't want to say God is arbitrary, but we also want to say that everything that exists out there is dependent on God, even for its goodness and whatnot. So most Christians, or I should say a lot of Christians have tried to answer this and maintain both God's sovereignty and the non-arbitrariness of his commands like this. And this would be considered a soft form of divine command theory. So a hard form would be more like William Ockham, who says whatever God says just is, and it just is that way because he commands it. A softer form, which has been embraced by C.S. Lewis, Norman Geisler, William Lane Craig, would say something like, well, God issues commands according to his good nature or his character. God's not going to issue commands apart from his character. Okay, so that is the basic way out or way of defeating the Euthyphro dilemma for a lot of Christians. It's very popular. I would say it's the go-to answer for most Christians today to try to figure out how to maintain God's sovereignty on the one hand and his non-arbitrariness on the other. So is this a good option? Well, it's popular, and I've named some heavy hitters, right? C.S. Lewis, Bill Craig, Norman Geisler. There's some main thinkers in philosophy, apologetics, and biblical studies and theology. But I'm going to question this as a good strategy for Christians. Why? Well, let me ask two questions about this. One, what does it mean for God to have character in this sense? These guys oftentimes mean that God issues command according to his good moral character. So God is considered a moral being in this context when this kind of answer is offered for the Euthyphro dilemma, for the problem of evil. And if you know me at all in my work on the problem of evil, then you know that I don't take God to be a moral being. Okay, what does it mean to be a moral being? It means that in some way or another, you are under some kind of moral law, moral obligation. And it's easy for us as creatures to see how we are under moral obligation and moral law. But the question is, what does it mean for God to be under moral law or moral obligation? Well, you get different answers from different people. So some atheists I've debated have said, well, God is moral by virtue of him simply being a rational being. So, for example, James Sturba of Notre Dame, who I've debated in print and in person, a great guy, I like him a lot, nice guy. He says that God, and Gary Wittenberger, who I've also written with, has said that God is moral just by virtue of being rational. And that in the case of Gary Wittenberger, he thinks that God actually has created the moral framework that we're under. He calls it correct universal ethics, and that God voluntarily subsumes himself under that. I don't think most Christians would hold to God creating some moral standard and then just kind of willingly subduing himself or subordinating himself under that. But a lot of Christians take God in some way or another to be a moral agent or a moral being. The question is, what does that mean? What does it mean for God to be that way? Because if he's not a moral being, then arguing, well, he only issues commands according to his good nature doesn't seem to be a very good argument. Because if he's not moral, then he doesn't issue commands according to his moral nature, because he wouldn't have a moral nature. So I submit that I'm not going to get into the whole ball of wax here. You can look at my other work elsewhere. I've written a book recently on it. It's called God, Evil, and Morality, and it's written with Michael Shermer and Gary Wittenberger, and this is a debate with us in this book. James Sturba and Richard Howe actually have a chapter summarizing, or not summarizing, but kind of critiquing the debate. And I have stuff on my website and other articles that are also on my website about this. But and kind of to get to the main point, to be a moral being means you've got some kind of moral law or moral obligations imposing on you as a being. And as God, as the supreme being, he can't be the supreme being and also be subject to some kind of moral code, or he wouldn't be the supreme being. That would be a contradiction. All right. So if that's the case, that God is not a moral being, and I think we can see this illustrated in the gospel. In the book of Job, for example, God allows Satan to do some horrible things to Job, kill his children, kill his servants, his cattle, destroy things, even harm himself directly. And at the end, God doesn't offer, what we normally would take as a theist, as a theodicy, or as a defense of sorts of God's existence or character. God basically says, to quote one of my professors, I'm God, you're not, shut up. That's the basic way. God does not mince words, starting about chapter 38 in the book of Job, after we hear Job complain to his friends back and forth about whether or not God should have allowed him or not to undergo such suffering. So I think we have good philosophical and biblical arguments to show that God isn't really under the kind of obligation that we are. But let's say that he was. Let's say that God is under some kind of divine morality, as it were. How does a being that's infinite and also non-human serve as the grounding and the source of human morality? If God is an infinite being and he's a non-human, then he's infinitely non-human. So God is, in the classical sense, which I was obviously endorse and trying to argue for here, he is not made up of parts, therefore he doesn't change. He's not temporal. He's eternal. He's impassible. He's immaterial, and he's necessary. We're on the opposite side of all that, right? So we are changing. We are temporal, made up of parts. We're not necessary. We're contingent. How could a being that's so radically and infinitely different be the source and the foundation of our morality? I mean, God really can't even do the things that we do to be immoral. God really can't commit murder, because committing murder is taking life that doesn't belong to you. Well, God owns all life as a sovereign creator. If he wants to judge people either directly or through other people, he has the prerogative to do that. He can't commit sins that require a body. He can't commit sexual sins or lustful sins. He can't steal things. He owns everything. I mean, God just can't do the kind of things that we can do as sinful people. But there seems to be then another option for trying to answer the question, how do we maintain God as the source of morality while also not being completely arbitrary? Well, another theory on the table is natural law. Now, what is natural? This is also endorsed by, again, C.S. Lewis and Norman Geisler, not Bill Craig, but Norman Geisler and C.S. Lewis also held to this theory. And natural law simply says that we as humans have a certain kind of nature or essence that we all share, and some things simply are good and promote the good of our nature and our being, and some things prohibit that or cause bad things for us or evil. So since we all have an objective nature, then it's always wrong to do certain things, like murder somebody, like to rape somebody, to steal. There are some possible exemptions for that, like we see with the David going through the fields and taking things, and or Matt asked the question: is it wrong for someone to steal bread from his neighbor if he's starving and his family's starving? But there are some things that are just objectively wrong for the human nature, right? To deprive one of food, to harm someone physically in whatever way is wrong, unless there's some kind of justification like self-defense or war or something like that. So, but natural law says that there is an objective nature or essence that humans all share. So, if God decided, I am going to create humans, he's going to create them according to this view that we all share an essence, that, well, if we create humans with characteristics A, B, and C, then some things are good for A, B, and C, and some things are bad for it. And this will be across the board. So there are some things that are objectively bound up with our nature and what makes us what we are, such that certain actions promote our happiness and goodness, and some things cause harm, suffering, and evil, physical evil. So I think this way we can explain both the fact that we as humans rely on God as our cause, both for our existence and for our morality. Because God, we can say God is our ultimate cause of both our existence and our morality, but not in the sense that he is the paradigm for our morality. To put it in Aristotelian terms, he's the efficient cause of both our being and our morality, but he's not the formal cause, meaning that we're not tied to God in some way and mirror his divine morality, because we're not divine and God's not a human. So that it just seems to make sense that God is not the paradigm for human morality. There are ways, Jesus says, you might be thinking, well, doesn't Jesus say be perfect like God's perfect? Yeah, so that word perfect can be known as complete. Now, we're not perfect like God is in the sense of humans being like a perfect, infinite divine being. I don't think that's what Jesus meant. I think Jesus had more in the idea of be complete like my Father is complete. The word there for perfect can mean complete. It doesn't necessarily mean morally or metaphysically perfect, although he does tell it to be morally perfect, but not in a divine way, in a human way. Jesus is our paradigm for human nature and how we should act and behave. Well, this gets at a really good distinction that I think is useful in a lot of contexts, and that is the distinction between God creating necessarily or not. So some will say, well, if God creates a human, can he just up and say, well, raping a human is a good thing or murdering a human? No. Then isn't God not the standard? Well, if God decides to create something like humans with an objective nature and essence, then he's going to will the good for those things of that species, for us to be humans. So if he wills humans to exist, he wills their goodness. So God cannot both will humans to be good and will them not to be good, in the sense of willing their good to be realized, their final cause, their intention, in other words, their goal of existence, which ultimately I think is to glorify God. So no, when God decides to create, he's not under any kind of necessity to create. He could create or not. But when he decides to create, supposing that he decides to create, then he in a sense decides to create a certain thing and cannot create that thing and not create that thing at the same time and sense. It would be a contradiction. So, in other words, if God's going to will the goodness of humans, he can't will the goodness of that human to be different than what the nature calls for without altering that nature. So in willing an objective nature, he wills certain things to be done for the goodness of that nature. And because he's willing that the teleology and the intentionality of that nature, he can't just up and say, okay, it's all of a sudden good to murder somebody or to rape them or to cut the arm off or whatever you want to fill in the blank with. Because God cannot, it's not that God lacks omnipotence, but if you've heard me say this before, God can't do what is in itself impossible, such as willing a circle to be square at the same time. Well, you can't will raping or murdering a human to be good while maintaining that nature to be what it is at the same time in the same sense. So I think this natural law approach to morality, to human morality, answers the Euthyphro problem. It keeps intact God's sovereignty, his aseity, and the objectivity of morality, because we're not going to just willy-nilly have a different moral law code because God wills it. Because once God wills to do something, this is where that distinction comes in. The absolute necessity of God versus a conditional necessity. Absolute necessity here, going back to Aristotle and picked up by people like Thomas Aquinas, says that God wills things that are absolutely necessary. They can't not will, like his own being, his own existence, and such like that. But there are some things that are considered conditionally necessary, like God does not have to create humans. But if he decides to create humans with a certain nature, then he also has to decide to create humans where we have certain actions that promote their good, that go along with their nature. So the nature of humans are objective. Therefore, the commands and what makes their morality objective is tethered to the objectivity of their overall essence and nature. I realize I'm making a lot of rough recalls here on a very divisive philosophical issue, a lot of them. Hope you got something out of this. I hope we can think about the problems that we look at with divine command theory, and there are other problems as well, but the Euthyphro is one of the main ones. And think about the typical answer that Christians give about God willing things according to his own nature. What does it mean for God to will? It's wrong for one human to kill another human. How was that flowing out of God's nature? That seemed like it was flowing out of divine decree to create humans. That's wrapped up in the nature of a human instead of the divine nature. It's wrapped up in the human nature. Not that it has power in itself, but since God created it, he is the sovereign and sustainer, sovereign cause and sustaining cause of that nature. So I'm making a lot of referee calls here. I understand that. Other questions about divine command theory will be, well, one, you've got to know what the commands are. How do you have access to the commands? And of course, we would debate with Mormons and Muslims and Hindus and different people about what the commands actually are. That'll be a different debate altogether. Not that you can't know, but it's an epistemological question. How do you know? And I would say, if we have divine commands, then having a divine command, like when God says, do this or don't do this, that is a sufficient condition that makes the morality of that action guaranteed to have a moral weight to it. So do we have to have a divine command where God says, don't do this? So if God never says don't murder, would it be wrong to murder? Well, in Romans 2, Paul tells us that even if we don't have the law, the Mosaic law of the Old Testament, we have a law written on our hearts. So we have certain things. People who have never heard of Jesus or the Bible in primitive places around the world throughout time still have the moral law written on their hearts and also have general revelation. As C.S. Lewis has pointed out and other natural theorists have pointed out, there's a basic moral law code that goes across the history of humanity throughout time that says, no culture really says it's good to murder somebody or it's good to rape somebody or do anything like that. So that shows, I think, the objectivity of these moral codes and commands. So there are some interesting questions that are raised here with divine command theory. So I think that having a divine command makes it sufficient, but it's not necessary for God to say, don't do X, Y, and Z, because God has revealed it through revelation, through reason, and from our heart, having the law written on it. So that is divine command theory and the Euthyphro Dilemma. I hope that was helpful to you and that you can ponder these things and think about them and consider the ramifications of all these philosophical debates. And thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.